In the 1890s, Wilmington was a bustling port town and thriving center for African Americans. Whites maintained the ruling elite, but many whites flocked in and out for seasonal labor. Blacks were a majority in 1890, with a white population of 8,731 whites and 11,324 blacks. Blacks held respectable jobs, participated in government, education, and more. In the local election of 1890, Republicans rallied their strong base of African American support and combined efforts with the Populist Party. As a result, Daniel Russell was elected as the first Republican governor in the area since the Civil War. He established more laws allowing increased black participation in political affairs. After several years of Republican rule, the Democrats viewed the 1898 election as pivotal. Furnifold Simmons created a powerful Democratic political machine using media and intimidation. Wilmington became headquarters for the Democratic campaign and white supremacy. Fierce Democratic leader Alfred Moore Waddell fueled intimidation of Republican leaders and voters by proclaiming in speeches that Democrats would win the election and that whites would choke the Cape Fear with carcasses if necessary.
Alex Manley was a mulatto editor of the local newspaper, the Wilmington Daily Record, and a targeted component in the Wilmington race riots. He wrote an article in response to claims that white women needed to be better protected from black men, stating that our experience among poor white people in the country teaches us that women of that race are not any more particular in the matter of clandestine meetings with colored men than the white men with colored women. This was one of the elements of that time that enraged whites and Democrats who used his statements for the benefit of their campaign. On the election day, November 8th, 1989, the Republicans lost their fusionist strength with the Populists, highly because of Daniel Russell's inability to satisfy either side. The Democrats in all surrounding areas used this to ignite determination and rally support. Due to unusually high Democratic and unusually low Republican turnout, Democrats won the election, obtaining a majority in legislature where they immediately began to pass disenfranchisement laws. The next day, on November 9th, a large group of white men, invigorated by their victory, met at the courthouse to place a series of demands and restraints on the African American community. Along with insisting upon the resignation of the chief of police, Mayor Ed Manley, they presented a white Declaration of Independence. The preamble stated that we, the undersigned citizens of the city of Wilmington and county of New Hanover, do hereby declare that we will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin. They presented this to a group of educated and influential black leaders of the community called the Committee of Colored Citizens, who then formulated a respectful response. The next morning, on November 10th, Waddell planned a meeting at the Wilmington Light Infantry Armory where he was going to receive and present the response from the committee, but when the response had not yet arrived, Waddell led the crowd to Manley's press building. Manley himself had already fled the city to avoid certain lynching. The men proceeded to destroy and burn the building. They took time to pause for a photograph and then return home or to the armory. Only a brief time later, around 11 that morning, in a predominantly African-American neighborhood called Brooklyn, shots were fired, leaving 2 black men dead. Chaos erupted on the streets, with both races armed, running to the scene.
White Brooklyn resident Will Mayo was supposedly wounded by a shot near a street where the first 2 blacks were killed. In seeking revenge, many whites ran rampant, shooting at any black man they saw. Mayo phoned the Wilmington Light Infantry to inform Walker Taylor of the violence that had erupted, to which he dispatched the troops in an attempt to suppress it. Before troops could do anything, shots were fired in Manhattan Park and several more African American men were killed. The killing was not limited to these incidents, however. According to some accounts, a violent march through the city preceding them rained terror and brutal death on many innocent blacks. Reverend J. Allen Kirk of the Central Baptist Church in Wilmington recalls actions of the mob, saying that they went from house to house looking for Negroes that they considered offensive, took arms that they had hidden, and killed them for the least expression of manhood. They gathered around colored homes, firing like great sportsmen, firing at rabbits in the open field.
Amid the chaos of the day, Waddell and others sought the resignation of the mayor and board of aldermen. Waddell was then elected mayor by a new board of aldermen handpicked by the Democratic leaders, which many consider a coup, not a fair election or appointments. Soon after assuming power, Waddell fired all black appointed officers and employees. Throughout the day, predominant African American political, religious, and economic leaders were jailed and banished. They were promised that return would result in physical harm or death. Even ministers were left in the woods and country places to flee for their lives. During the riots and soon after, many blacks and their families fled the city, changing a population where they once had a almost 3,000 person majority in 1890 to a population in 1900 where there were 10,556 whites and 10,407 blacks. Many records and attempts at preserving the memory of these tragedies have been made. In 1998, the General Assembly of North Carolina established the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot Commission to develop a historical record of the event. The 1989 Foundation in Wilmington erected a large memorial sculpture set in the Memorial Park. It is intended as a means of honoring, looking forward, and reconciliation. 6 bronze paddles standing over 16 feet high honoring African tradition concerning the symbolism of water and using the paddle to cross over into the next life. These traditions were still kept by many African Americans of colonial times and serve as a memorial to those who lost their lives in the 1898 violence. Among many unfair laws passed by Democrats in that time was the suffrage amendment of 1900, which virtually eliminated blacks from voting and established segregation that would last till the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. These events in Wilmington model the national embrace of Jim Crow law, racism, and white supremacy. They gave way to black disenfranchisement and segregation in the city that persisted over halfway through the 20th century.
And the beginning of a strong civil rights movement in the 1950s was commonly known as a Jim Crow law. Segregation was extended to parks, theaters, restaurants, forms of transportation, and any public area, even cemeteries. They did this to prevent any contact between blacks and whites as equals. In 1890, Louisiana passed a law that required state accommodations for blacks and white passengers on railroads. In 1892, a man named bought a ticket and boarded a train and sat in the whites-only car, even though he had a mixed racial background. He was told to move to a different car, but he refused to and was arrested because of it. This was the beginning of the famous case Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This court case stated that segregation was, in fact, constitutional as long as the conditions were equal. However, this was commonly not the case, and many times whites would have much higher quality items than blacks, such as water fountains. Along with Jim Crow laws, blacks were being deprived from their legal right to vote, also known as disenfranchisement. Plessy versus Ferguson was just the beginning of segregation and unequal rights for blacks. This case was not overturned until 58 years later in Brown versus Board of Education, which also helped strike down other Jim Crow